thank you everyone for coming. I'm David Sella-Villa. I am the Chief Privacy Officer with the South Carolina Department of Administration, and I'm the head of the Enterprise Privacy Office. And this is my boss.
Hey everybody, I'm Jay Meyer. I am the CIO at Department of Administration and currently the acting CISO as well.
Yeah, and so the question is, why are two of us here to talk today about security and privacy? And really, the core of this comes down to the fact that the two concepts are so deeply interrelated. The analogy we like to use is that of a safe. You don't know what safe to build until you know what you need to put into the safe. And privacy is what you put into the safe, really. And so from a security perspective, what kind of questions would you ask about the safe?
Yeah, so exactly. From a cyber perspective, you're trying to protect what's in the safe. So that's putting safeguards in place, having things like alarms, knowing what to do if that alarm goes off, and then ultimately how to respond and recover in case that safe is opened up.
Right, so the data is going to dictate what the protections are going to look like. And it's a simple analogy, it's obviously the devil's in the details, but the simple analogy is you don't know what alarms to put around, what protections to put around until you know what you're trying to protect. And so looking at this from the government perspective, where we sit within the Department of Administration is the Office of Technology and Information Services. And so Jay's going to tell us a little bit about how we are organized.
Sure. Just real quick to relate to kind of why we're all here today. We're trying to take a look at a holistic approach to cybersecurity for the entire state. And that's really bringing a mind share together to share ideas and come up with ways that we can kind of tackle the current challenges that we have with cybersecurity, while at the same time driving economic development and workforce development. So in 2014, state government recognized that we had a similar situation within state agencies. We had a very decentralized model where state agencies, large and small, were responsible for their own information security, their own privacy, their own technology. So the legislative branch and executive branch got together and said, how can we have a more centralized approach to technology for the state agencies and for information security? And thus in 2014, they created the Department of Administration. So within our department, we've got three major divisions to address that problem of a holistic view and services for technology, information security, and privacy in state agencies. One is the Division of Information Security. And through this division, we've been able to establish a statewide cybersecurity policy and statewide cybersecurity program that includes things that you've heard talked about today, like endpoint detection, having monitoring in place for networks and for end-user computing, having an overall incident response plan in place in case of a cyber attack, and then having recovery procedures in place through the cybersecurity program. And then we also have established, which David is leading now, the Enterprise Privacy Office, and that is to also have a statewide policy for privacy and statewide resources to help agencies with their privacy policies and posture. And then finally, a Division of Technology Services that provides centralized IT services to state agencies. And I think what's most important with these services is that we do integrate best practices and policies for information security and privacy into those technology services.
Yeah, and so the authority for this comes out of a recurring proviso that is, in this current budget, is 93.9, that pretty much says we have to put forth these policies and try to find a way to get other agencies to adopt them. So what does that look like in practice, right? You know, as you can tell, Jay's probably given that spiel a few times, right? We try to convert this into a framework that's actually accessible. And the one that we are moving towards in the state now is the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so,
Yep, that's right. So NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and CSF is cybersecurity framework. So what this does, how this helps us, is it really puts in plain terms that an entire organization can understand on how to align policies, best practices, and programs to address these major areas of cybersecurity. So basically the 5 pillars are to identify the information assets that you're trying to protect. So put together a program that accomplishes that. Then to protect those assets, data and information security or technology assets. Then be able to identify if you do have a threat actor in your environment, detect. and then respond if you do have a threat actor in your environment, and ultimately recover from that threat actor.
Now, with my legal background, this is all very nice, but really the reality of it is that each of these pillars stands on some kind of legal footing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move through each of these pillars. I'm going to talk a little bit about the legal background, at least within South Carolina, as to what we're trying to achieve from a legal perspective. And Jay is going to give us some war stories, for lack of a better word, as to what that actually looks like in practice. But it would be a shame for all of us to be sitting here and think that we have all the answers to this. So if you have a question, if you have something you want to share when it comes up in this context, raise your hand. I don't have my phone with me, so I'm not able to access the Whova app at the moment, but just raise your hand and we'll hear from each other on this one. So the first, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to build off that real quick. So if you are a student in this area in cybersecurity and you've got questions about how these things are implemented in state government or in private industry, please ask that question as we're walking through. If you're a vendor and you want to plug a solution that you have or a way you can address one of these items, please do that as well. Or if you're a practitioner and you just want to share how you've implemented this in the real world, please raise your hand. We'll toss the microphone around and would love for it to be an interactive session.
Wonderful. So the first thing that we have to do is identify. And the basic law that we have in South Carolina from a state government perspective is the Family Privacy Protection Act, which lists about 9 data points, including name and address, that every state agency that collects this information about citizens needs to at least be able to identify it and know where it is. So there's a legal basis for engaging in this part of the pillar.
All right, so this step is vitally important, and it's something that a lot of organizations do not spend enough time on. As we kind of walk through this framework, we talk about how you protect information and how you detect anomalies, respond to cyber attacks, and ultimately recover. But if you don't identify the data that you have and the assets that you're trying to protect, it makes everything else a lot more difficult. So what this really boils down to is understanding what information you have that you want to protect, where that information resides within your network and within your technology assets. And that may be something that resides, within the 4 walls of your building, your organization. It could also be a software application provided by a SaaS provider. So what's key, though, is understanding the data that you have, the data that's governed by laws, and having an inventory of that data and inventory of the assets within your organization. And again, this is something that a lot of folks overlook. It's relatively easy to purchase a product that's going to help provide protection and detection, but the usefulness of that only goes so far as understanding the data that you're trying to protect.
Any questions about identify, legal or otherwise? Okay. So the next one is protect. And so you would think that it's a fairly obvious point of law that you're supposed to protect the data, but it's a little trickier than you think, because the standard of what it means to protect ultimately comes down to a lovely lawyering word called reasonable, right? It's very hard to be incredibly prescriptive about what is the right kind of protection to have for particularly in the world of IT, where data is changing, technologies are changing, and so forth. So from a legal perspective, where we have the strongest footing is actually the South Carolina Freedom of Information Act. There is an exemption. It's not an exception. It's an exemption. It's straight up not public data for information that is related to security or the enforcement of security. We still, under FOIA, have to share how much money we're spending on security, but what it is and what we're protecting and so forth is sort of, you read that backwards into saying we have an obligation to secure stuff, right? That's one side. And then if you're dealing with certain specific data sets, and particularly if you're getting money from the federal government, they are much more prescriptive about what you're supposed to do from a legal perspective in the field of protection. And so 2 examples are that the HIPAA privacy and security rule creates sort of it's a moving standard, but nonetheless it is a standard as to what needs to be protected and how. And then also when it comes to CMS, they have much more technical requirements about interacting on a technical basis there with data in that space. So these are the legal background for achieving protect. So it's not as strong as we would see on the identify side.
All right, and then kind of putting this into practice, in order to protect the data that you are required by law to protect, or is information that you don't want exfiltrated out of your organization, There's a number of different things that we can do this in this arena, and you've probably heard in previous talks, notably the last one, how you can implement protection. But you really have to look at your entire threat landscape. So you can do things like implementing firewalls to protect the edge, protect your network. You can do things like encrypting data at rest, given you understand where that data is, working with vendors to understand what their security posture is, so you know if there's any vulnerabilities for where your data is residing outside your organization. And what was mentioned and focused on in the last discussion is the biggest part of the threat landscape is really the end user and the end user devices that they're working on. This is where employees in an organization have access to that data, that you might have network protection, you might have encryption at rest, but it's really at the endpoint where people within the organization are using this data that we really need to focus on a lot of this protection. So that can take the shape of that endpoint detection and response, where you can apply software solutions to identify anomalies on a given endpoint, detect those anomalies, provide alerts, and potentially remediate or cut off access to those threats right there at the endpoint. But equally as important as putting some of these technology protections in place is to really educate the end user. You could have all the protections in the world, but if an end user falls victim to a phishing attack, or they voluntarily provide information unknowingly to a threat actor, or potentially unknowingly download malware onto that computer, which can then allow a threat actor to exfiltrate data. This is really an area of focus that I think there's a lot more heightened awareness into educating end users. And then I think it boils down to, how do you do that effectively? How do you do that beyond just annual security training, where employees are watching a video for 15 or 20 minutes and
do you recommend shock collars as part of that?
That's an approach.
An approach, okay.
I don't know if we can do that in state government.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, maybe in private sector you could get away with it, but yeah.
But finding creative ways to have interactive learning experiences with the end user where they can engage. You know, maybe it's a phishing campaign that is put out by your information security team, where they're throwing those test emails out to the user population, and see if they actually respond in the way that you expect them to. Do they alert on the phishing attack, or do they fall victim to the phishing attack? And kind of giving them that real-time feedback on how they could have responded differently. So again, when it comes to protecting, you can put a lot of software solutions, technology solutions in place, but it really needs to be investment in that end user training.
Any war stories about this one? Yes.
We gotta use the box.
And okay.
Talk to the cube. Yeah.
State employee, and if I leave today, what are my rights? Like with the employee data, like for example, I have OneDrive, I have whole teams, like like some people, they have like 20 years of data,
Sure.
their emails. So always the question comes, what do we do? Like, can that person, just dump everything on their hard drive and take it home?
Yeah. So I can just sort of answer the question from the legal side, and then Jay, if you want to tackle more of the practical side of it. From the legal side, that's not, that data, in short, in just the example you gave here, doesn't strictly belong to the person, it's the state's data, right? And so that doesn't mean that somebody doesn't put some stuff on a thumb drive and take it home to keep working on it from time to time. But if that is going to be the position that an agency takes, then I think that it's one thing to put that on paper, and it's another thing to put the technical controls in place and the other administrative controls in place to not allow the scenario that you described, which is somebody doing a data dump of 20 years of information before walking out the door. But I'm at the edge of my technical knowledge, so I'll pass that one to Jay on that one.
No, yeah, I think that, I'll let David speak to the legal standpoint of that, but I think that's something that typically boils down to the policy of the organization that you're working for, and who owns the information. I think when it comes to your personal information, which could, typically resides within HR, there are laws that protect the employee in that situation, and that's, through that data identification that we were speaking about before, that is one of the focal points for any organization, is how do they protect that employee data. But as far as taking that data with you, I think that typically boils down to company or organizational policies.
And also, like, I'm trying kind of like getting information for a year, trying to find all the state policies, because we're supposed to follow the state policies. But whenever I go, there's no mention about OneDrive. And if I see the policy, that's from 2014, the security policy.
Sure.
Which is like not aligned with what we're thinking right now.
Right.
So,
No, and that's part of the reason that we are moving towards the NIST framework, right? Because I think it's much more in line with that. But as to the question of like specific technologies, right? So OneDrive, for example, was not super common in state government in 2014, and now is a bit more common. I think that where the reality is at a policy level is, in very, very, very high level terms, is do the right thing. But what that looks like for your organization versus another organization from a policy perspective, we risk telling people what to do without knowing their business well enough to tell them to do it correctly, if that makes any sense, right? And so at least with OneDrive, Jay, can you think of some of the technical controls within that technology that we might be able to, that an agency might be able to use to sort of achieve compliance with cybersecurity?
Yeah, so with a product like OneDrive, there is built-in data loss prevention, that either restricts information from being moved out of that environment or potentially logs and alerts. And then, of course, there's with a technology like OneDrive, you do have that access control that can be managed, through best practices and policies, that when an employee leaves a company, they should immediately lose access to those resources.
All right. So, yes, well, we'll start with you, Doug.
So, I really like the conversation.
Right. So do you want to finish up for us, or are you good? Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One of the challenges that I think we always see, having been in that role, is that you've got the words of the policies, the creation of the policies, the implementation, and then what happens when there's a problem.
Right.
And when you put those three together, there's usually a lot of friction. How did you guys, or how are you planning on balancing things that say, hey, we shall destroy data
Right.
when it's out used? Well, with modern backups, that may or may not be possible, but if you have a shall and the agency doesn't do it, have I unnecessarily created liability?
Right. So I'm going to answer that question by skipping ahead. Right. And so really where I think we try to address that at the biggest level, and so not to skip over detect, right? But to answer your question, that is a combination of respond and then and recover, right? So what is it that we're aiming to do in the leading from the problem, in the sense of like when we have the problem? So from the guidelines and standards, we try to sort of have a playbook that as this is the problem, this is how we're always going to respond to it, so that is the moment when liability is most likely to be realized, and we're doing the most that we can protect ourselves there. Now, as the state, that's truly a secondary concern for us, because let's just say it's harder to sue us, right? There are at least some lawyers in the room. That's a fair statement about suing the state. But aside from that, our primary objective is to actually serve the citizens. And in this narrow context here, that means protect their data, right? So with thinking about what are we doing to maximize the protection of data, it tends to line everything up beyond that. I hope that's a fair answer to your question. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I'll just try to address quickly. I think it comes down to investment. So it is one thing to write a policy. It's a whole other thing to operationalize that policy. So people have to understand the policies in place. They have to understand how they, in their role, can make sure that they're in compliance with that policy. And then you have to put as many technical and automated controls in place, because not everybody's got policy at the top of their mind in their day-to-day work. And so, and keeping these things top of mind comes down to education. And so again, it's not easy to operationalize these policies, but you really have to invest in them to bring it to life.
Just very quickly, wanted to get to the recover slide, and just selfishly, this is the one that's most fascinating to me from a legal perspective, is what does recovery after an incident look like, right? And really the main thing is, what is the mission of the agency, right? If we're not to a point where the agency is fulfilling its mission, then the rest of it, for at least from a legal perspective, it doesn't seem like we've recovered. Any thoughts on recovery, Jay?
I'll just do a really quick rewind. So if you've done everything you can to protect your data, another thing you've got to be looking for is that detection. So understanding when you have a threat actor or indicators of compromise in your environment, and then getting to that response. So I want to harp on this really quick. So if you do detect an anomaly in your environment, what do you do about it? The biggest thing here is having a plan and knowing who to call when you have an incident. Doing tabletop exercises around this, because again, it's one thing to have a plan, it's another to know actually how to carry that through, and getting reps through doing tabletop exercises is a great way to get some reps and get practice so that when you do have an incident, you're able to respond in a timely manner. As we mentioned, average 277 days to detect and to respond to that incident. The more you can shorten that, the more you mitigate the recovery activities you're going to have to go through to get back to your prior state.
So very quickly, know your data. The rest will flow from there. Know the laws that apply to your data. And if you have any questions, as much as our role is to serve the agencies, we really try to serve the citizens of the state. So feel free to get in touch with us if we can help you out with anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.